Melissa, I'm going to stop the recording and because I forgot when I turn this on, it starts to record. I'll either that or I'll clean it up at the end.
Oh, no worries.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us for this webinar session today from the Arkansas Small Business and Technology Development Center. Our guest speaker, who is actually seems to be a part of our team, is joining us today, Melissa Forziata, on how to launch a successful marketing campaign. And I just want to tell you a little bit about our center. We are located in Fayetteville and Bentonville in Northwest Arkansas. We are here to help you start a business, grow a business, buy or sell a business. Whatever challenges you may be having with your small business, we can help you with that. We've got the experts ready to help you with a business plan, marketing, starting, as I said, starting a business. So if you're not a client of the University of Arkansas Small Business Development Center, I would encourage you to go to our website, which I will post in the chat later, and register as a client. All of our services are at no cost to you. We're grant funded. And so I would like to go ahead and turn this over to Melissa for her to talk to us about launching a successful marketing campaign. Melissa?
Yes, thank you so much, Julie. And also just thank you to Julie and Mary Beth and everybody at the ASB TDC for organizing another one of these webinars. It's always a pleasure to be back speaking with this group. I love that there's always such great engagement in the chat, and hello to everybody. I'll say just a little bit about myself for those who haven't seen me speak before, because I do think that it provides a little bit of context on how I think about this material. So I actually started out in my career doing major international sport events. I worked Olympic Winter Games, Rugby World Cup. I worked with the US Olympic Committee. So huge brands operating at a really big scale. And one of the interesting things about that type of work is that when you're working for something like an Olympic Games, they're launching things all the time. Like you have an event that's a couple weeks long, but you're doing launches of all the different elements of the brand, the look, the feel, the naming, the everything that you can possibly think of to launch is launched separately over the course of years. And so, I really got a chance to see sort of a process unfold on a very big scale, admittedly. And then about a dozen years ago, I started my own business, and I work mostly with small businesses and nonprofits through that for marketing. And so I had to figure out, how do you take those great principles of marketing and launching campaigns that I learned at that huge scope, but make those principles work for businesses like yours and mine that don't have anywhere near those resources. So for me, this is about approaching marketing from a practical perspective, from a resource-driven perspective, and from an efficiency perspective. For me, it's all about sort of squeezing every last drop out of every marketing campaign you're trying to do and really thinking efficiently about it. So that's how I will approach this topic. And, before we get into any specific details, I wanted to just offer a few quick housekeeping items. So first of all, I encourage everybody to stay on mute throughout this presentation, but I also, even though you're on mute, I would love for you to be able to minimize distractions on your end, because the more you're thinking about your business in the context of this material, the more you're going to get from the material. So if you have the ringer on your phone or a messaging device on in the background, this is a great time to shut those things down so that you can really hone in on your business during this time. Now, I should say, I always have a lot of slides, and I always try to make sure that there are slides that are meant to be resources for later. And this is especially so. There's going to be a whole section of this presentation where you're going to think, Melissa, you have some nerve having like slides that almost look exactly the same with minor changes between them. There's a reason that am presenting this way. I want this to be sort of a roadmap for you for after this presentation is done, to be able to sit with it and start sort of plugging in your own ideas and things that might work for your own business. So I wanted this to be a roadmap. It's intended to be used later for that purpose. So if you feel like you're missing any information, just know that you'll get those slides later. I've got a landing page link at the very last slide that's going to give you all of these resources. The only thing it won't have is the recording that Julie's currently getting, and I'm sure she'll send that separately. And then lastly, in terms of questions, this material really builds as we go along. So I'll encourage you to ask your questions at the end. And there may be some times along the way that I ask you questions, and I'll encourage you to respond in the chat at that time. So having said that, just to make sure we all know where our chat is right now, and go ahead in there. I've introduced myself. Feel free to introduce yourself and your business. Make sure it's set to everyone so we can all see your responses. And that way we'll know that we're all set up for if I do ever ask you questions along the way. So having said all of that, how are we going to approach this conversation about marketing campaigns today? Well, first, we're going to define campaign. I have to give you some boundaries for what we're talking about. Then we're going to talk a little bit about setting objectives. Then we're going to look at establishing timelines. And then lastly, we'll talk a little bit about debriefing. And so hopefully between all of those different sections, we'll cover the big picture of marketing campaigns. So if that all sounds good to you, you're in the right place. And let's jump in. Let's talk about how to launch a successful marketing campaign. All right, first things first, we have to define what we're talking about when we say the word campaign. And for me, that can be a lot of different things if we look at it even loosely in the context of this presentation. So let's focus on things that can be especially complex in terms of campaigns. First of all, an event, any sort of an event at all, could be considered a campaign. There could be a lot of micro campaigns within that even, but any event is inherently its own launch date. And so, you have to think about all the ways that you want to put messaging around an event, whether that's online, offline, hybrid, or anything in between. New messaging could potentially be something that could be a campaign for you. And that can be, any new information that you're sharing with the audience. It could be any, it could be a rebrand, which I'll add in here, but it can also just be anything that you're adding to the landscape of all the messaging that you've already put out there. It could also be a product or service launch. It could be an initial launch of your entire brand, but it could also be that your brand has been up and running for some time. Your business has been up and running for some time, and you just want to launch something new that you're selling. New partnerships, that's another thing that could be a campaign launch for you, or you could treat it that way. The idea of building the partnership, setting the rules around that, that's all done behind the scenes, and then announcing that to the public. And then what do you do with that? How do you leverage that moving forward? All of that can be a campaign as well. Contests, which is sort of an event, but it's, a specific kind of a thing, and that can be leveraged in a lot of different ways as well. And of course, new programs. If I said new product or service launches, I should also say new programs, because for some of you, programmatic elements are more your service. So that is perhaps not a comprehensive list. I'm sure you could make an argument that there are other things that could be campaigns, but I really wanted to give you a nice big scope for what could be involved in that, because as long as as long as it's something that has many elements, many opportunities to communicate with your audience, or even multiple audiences, that is something that we can treat as a campaign for the purposes of this presentation. So if you had one particular thing in your mind when you went into this and that doesn't feel like the exact right fit for your business, that would make it more likely that you'd tune out. And I'm hoping this broadens that definition for you, where if there's something that you're working on that falls into one of these categories, you feel like there's something in this presentation for you. So the thing that's most important, the thing that binds all of those things together, they're all different types of events or campaigns or whatever to be messaged, but what they have in common is that they give you an opportunity for potential multi-channel marketing, talking to people through all of the different ways that you're currently marketing, and perhaps new ones that you've never leveraged before. It could also mean that you've got different streams for different audiences that you're trying to reach, different target markets within your audience. So all of these things can be leveraged. Ideally, you do leverage as many of them as possible to get the most out of whatever campaign you're running. Now, again, any of these campaigns that I'm talking about, many of them can be online, they could be in person, they could be hybrid. It's not necessarily about a specific format. It's about saying, I have a thing I need to announce. I have a thing that I need to get up and running. I have a thing that I need to launch. There's something new to present. And that becomes a backdrop for all of the messaging that you would ultimately do. Now, the reason I threw the word complex in there is that if you can plan a complex campaign with many different elements or many different target markets or many different launches rolled into one launch, you can also plan something that's more simple than that. So, we're going to look at all of the options available for something that's a little bit more complex, and hopefully that makes it easier for you to break down planning for a campaign that doesn't have as many moving parts to it. Okay, so that's a bit of a definition here. What would be the first step, though, in this whole process to getting things up and running? Of course, you need to know what type of campaign you're doing, but sometimes that might be answered by setting objectives. So setting objectives is a really important first step. Sometimes that comes before, or sometimes that comes after deciding what actual campaign you're going to do. An important tip for setting objectives is you have to define success before you start to plan any campaign that you're going to do. Because how do you know if it worked if you didn't define what working looked like? And it's worth knowing, if you are the only person executing whatever your campaign is, then I guess you could just sit down and say, here's what success looks like. If you've got a team of people around you, or if you've got stakeholders around you, it's often good to have buy-in. It's often good to have this be a discussion where you together decide what success looked like, or at least you all agree on whatever your decision was. And that way you are all moving forward towards the same objectives as you go. If you do that up front, it helps people make decisions along the way that are going to be more in line with how you're going to get to that same success. And also, hopefully, it helps people feel more satisfied if and when you get to that point where you've achieved all of those milestones. So defining success is absolutely critical. And one of the reasons that I've been talking about sort of the order of deciding what the campaign is versus defining success is that it could very well be that you say, we know we're going to have an event, so what do we need to accomplish at it? But if you look at this from the reverse standpoint, if you say, here's what we need to achieve, what is the campaign that's going to get us there? It may actually change what your options are and how you go about getting to sort of the finish line of the whole thing. One of the things that is coming to mind for me right now as I say this is that when we think back to the start of the pandemic, I was so fascinated by how many sort of like emergency programming things were coming out for people to talk about the pandemic, about how their industry was handling it, about giving advice to entrepreneurs, rolling out projects and programs and grants. There were so many people who were launching things on a very tight timeline. It was a tighter timeline than you would normally want to have. And I think it got us in some unfortunate habits in terms of how long people expect you to have in the lead up to something really big that you have to plan. But I also think that when you've got when I saw this stuff coming out that was pandemic related programming or offers or information or programs, like all of that, it was happening so fast, but we were seeing all of these timelines expedited. And if you knew what your objective was, it changed how you would deliver it. Do you need a webinar? Do you need a contest? Do you need, are you trying to build your list for the future? Are you trying to inform people? Are you trying to gather information from people? And just seeing that really changed how people approach their audience, even on a tight timeline. So, now that we've got a little bit more room to breathe, ideally you want to elongate that process. You want to give people a little bit more time, and you want to give yourself more time in your planning, but you also want to give your audience more time to absorb information. So defining success is really a critical step, and it may be done before or after you decide what type of campaign you're actually running. And having said that, of course, clear objectives can often dictate what those best tactical options are for you. Like, for example, one of the things that I just said at the top of this presentation was that I have a whole series of slides in here that are meant to be takeaways for you later. And I set it up that way because I want you to use this material later to help you plan your campaign. But if my objective was something else, I might have set this up differently for you. So, these are all things to consider. You want to be intentional about the pathways that you set. Now, I'm talking a ton about what success looks like, but not actually giving you a description of what your options are. So that's what we're going to do here. What are some of the goals that you could be trying to achieve with a marketing campaign? And again, this can fall under any of those types of campaigns that I talked about earlier. One option that you have is aiming for brand awareness. It could be that the only thing that you're trying to accomplish is just making sure people have heard about your business, your company, whatever the thing is that you're trying to put out there. Maybe it's too early to ask them for something. Maybe you just asked them for something and you want to build back some trust. You want to build back some awareness and not sort of get their backs up at all. Brand awareness, people have to have heard of what you're doing before they can buy it, before they can accept a call to action. Sometimes they need a lot of messages before they're ready to take an action, especially if you have a big ticket item. So brand awareness could be by itself the only thing you're trying to achieve. Now, another option could be just driving website traffic. It could be that you're trying to, which is in its own way brand awareness, but it's also very specifically getting people to a website where you can start, raising your profile, getting perhaps Google or other search engines to rank you a little higher in the process, getting people to discover one page of the website so they can discover the rest of what your business offers. So that could be a goal that you're trying to achieve. Another goal could be establishing reputation. This could also be repairing reputation if your business needed that. But establishing reputation, if you feel like, not only do I want them to know that my brand exists, but I want them to have a specific impression of it. And you might approach that in a different way. It might be the difference between, for brand awareness, I am going to do an interview with a trusted third party. That's now going to be establishing reputation, versus if I just mentioned my own story, then I'm establishing awareness for myself. So there is a nuance there. Building stakeholder relationships is another one. And I think this can actually be weaved into any type of campaign that you do. So it could be that you're going to stakeholders that already exist that are connected to your business, and you're keeping them in the loop, and you're giving them first looks at things that you're planning to launch, and you're getting their input and feedback. It could also be that you're trying to build your network of new, stakeholders. And that is that last bullet point there, forging new partnerships, because it's a chance to bring new people into the fold. Now, lead generation is another potential campaign goal, and that can be looked at two different ways all on its own. You could be aiming for a high volume of leads, or you could be looking for high quality leads, which usually means lower volume. And there may be a lot of different decisions that might get you there. So for example, if you're planning to run an event, if you run a free event and you make people sign up for it, you're probably going to get more people, but they might have a loose interest in what you're doing. If you make people pay to attend that event, you're still getting the names of people. You might not get as many people, but they have a vested interest in it. They've got some skin in the game. They might be, they might inherently be people who would take your next call to action more seriously. Increasing revenue, that's another one. I mean, that may seem obvious. That may seem like the obvious goal that you have, but again, you can already see that there's quite a lot of options on this list. It may or may not be the thing that you're trying to achieve today to increase revenue. That could be an end goal for a future campaign. Setting up upsells is one more that I can add there. It could be that you could be doing a launch event to announce a launch. There's a lot of different ways that you can approach this, but hopefully this starts to give you just more options to pull from. If you have any of these things coming up in your future, the material here could be relevant for you and you can potentially apply it. Now, once you know what your goal is, what type of campaign you're going to run, what success looks like, how do you start planning for it? This is where we look at establishing the timeline. And again, I'm hoping that you give yourself enough room, enough time to let any campaign breathe. A lot of times when I'm talking with clients, they just assume that a campaign is just the launch day. But if you look at it as just the launch day, like let's say, for example, you're going to launch a new website. Some people will say, I'm launching my website on July 20th. Great. July 20th, that's your launch date. But then if you do nothing to brace people for the launch and you do nothing once the launch has happened, it usually falls pretty flat. It's like you put it out there and it's just crickets. What we want to do is we want to create a buzz for things. Then we want to launch it. And then we want to have a follow-up process with that. And the more we can stretch that, the more we get from it. So ideally, you look at this as 3 different stages. You have an on-ramp to the campaign. The longer that on-ramp, the juicier it can be. And the more you tease people with what the potential thing is that they're going to see, the more excitement you build for the actual launch day. Now, the day of could be, it could be that you have something that lasts 5 minutes, 1 hour, like an Olympic Games could last a couple of weeks. I worked an event called Rugby World Cup. That went on for about 2 months, that event. There's maybe you have an anniversary year and you're considering the entire year your launch. So depending on how you're looking at it, I put launch day of, but that could be, a longer or shorter time span. And then you want to have an off ramp as well. This is a really great part to start gathering feedback, to start gathering testimonials, to gather statistics that can help feed your marketing long term. Again, the longer your on-ramp is, the more successful your launch is likely to be. If you don't give people a heads up that something's coming, they're not ready for it when it comes. And so, the more you can get people involved somehow along the way, the more likely they are to be interested and excited when you are ready to launch. And for me, this seems like a really obvious thing to say, but when I talk to clients, I find out that it isn't. A lot of times people don't want to present something until it's 100% ready. And that's great. You don't need to present the final thing until it's launched, but you can show people the road to getting there. With that website example, people will say, I just don't want to, I'm just going to wait until it's launched to tell people about it. And then they'll see a fully finished product. But then you do that, nobody knew the website was there, and then the launch falls flat. The reverse of that would be to just start teasing people and saying, I'm working on something really exciting. Or you can say, I'm actually working on a new website, and here's what I did today to really help that process. Here's something I learned. Here's something I'm excited about. I just chose this color. I just chose this logo. And you can start dripping information out and getting people excited about it, still not having shown them the entire finished website because it's not ready yet. But, it just gets people excited to see what that product is. So on your launch day, you're not the only one celebrating. So the longer you make that on-ramp, the more you can get people to come with you on that process. And when you look at it this way, when you think of it not just as I have a day or a moment to launch this thing, instead, if you have, say, I have a whole on-ramp, then the launch, then I have a whole off-ramp. Now you've got tons of room to consider this campaign a backdrop for messaging people for months. For an Olympic Games, we were talking years for something like that. But how can you really maximize that? I used the word efficient earlier, And this may be sounding like a lot of work and very inefficient to you, but it's efficient in the context of you just do this one campaign, and how can you just make sure everybody that can possibly be folded into it gets folded into it? What tends to happen if you don't look at it this way is I'll find that a lot of people that I work with, they'll say, okay, so I did this campaign and now I'm going to do this campaign and now I'm going to do this campaign, because it lasted just a short time. They didn't get everything they wanted from it. And so they feel like they need to plan another thing and then another thing and then another thing. That's the inefficient part, because there's probably something that could connect all of these things together. There are probably ways to get people to come with you from one campaign to the next. If you just spent a little more time planning each one, you might find those missed opportunities. So, consider your campaign a backdrop for as much outreach as possible. Now, here's where it's going to get wacky with all of these slides. I want to help you work through designing your timeline. And so, the series of slides that's coming up is meant to sort of show you the steps in the process. So here's the base template that I want to look at. You've got sort of a timeline here on that horizontal axis. That blue bar going down the middle, we're going to say that's whatever your launch period is. If that's a day, if that's a week, if that's longer, we're going to mark that in time. And then I've got, before that period, we've got the on-ramp. And then after that, we've got the off ramp, and we're going to start slotting things into those spaces. And we'll talk about what order I would look at slotting them into. Now, first of all, you've got this basic structure. What types of things are going to go into this section? All of your businesses are different. You have different ways that you're potentially communicating to people. And so whatever examples I give here are not the it's not necessarily how you need to plan yours. You need to start dropping in what's relevant to your business. So the first thing I want to do is actually say what goes into each section and give you some options. I tried to make this as comprehensive as I could, but I'm sure you can come up with some other examples that aren't on this list. So where are some places, some ways that you're messaging to your audience now? What channels are you using? Well, maybe you have a website where you can put information. Maybe you have a blog goes out where you can share information about the launch, share information the day of, share information post-launch. Same thing with a newsletter. Maybe you have an email list that you're reaching out to. And maybe that's something that you're reaching out to on a regular basis. Maybe you have something that's going out monthly or weekly, or maybe you want to supplement that with a specific email blast or text blast around just this topic, even outside the context of a regular newsletter. Social media, there are so many different platforms out there. So you could break this up into, all the different platforms that you're using, but those could also be channels that you're using to get your message out. If I drop below this, are there any places where you can put targeted ads? And that's really anywhere that, if you pay, you can get an ad out there. So any source that's doing something like that, whether it be a publication, a bus bench, it could be all different kinds of things. Mailers could be another option. Do you want to get something to people in the mail? On-site signage. If you have a brick and mortar, if you have a physical location, if you have a pop-up shop where you could potentially be marketing other events that are coming up and people will actually be visiting you in person, all of this is a place where you can potentially have signage on site or on your booth or in your area that people can see to find out what's coming up for you. Partner outreach. However you would reach out to anybody who's connected to your business, any other businesses out there that could have a similar interest, any other stakeholders that could have a potential interest. Podcasts or interviews. This is sort of where we begin looking at like the earned media section, that and the PR and features below. Who out there would, what other publications, what other outlets have content of their own they're putting out, and how can you use that as a way of getting information out there? Stoking word of mouth. What are all the ways that you're currently reaching your existing customers? How can you get in front of them again? Self-hosted events. If there's anything else that you're running that would potentially be a good place to talk about your upcoming thing that you're going to launch, that's another option that you have as well. And then, of course, community events. things that you're not planning, but events that you're going to. It could be Chamber of Commerce events. It could be SBDC events. It could be any events in your community that feel relevant to you. So this is some examples of things that you could potentially plug into that timeline, that structure that I showed you earlier. But for the sake of doing this presentation, I do want to work through an example so that you can see how I think about this. Don't feel like you're tied to that if you have other elements of your marketing that you would want to weave in. Now, one more thing I want to say about it is with your marketing, you may find that you've got multiple target markets that you can reach with one campaign. And maybe you're using different communication tools, like that last slide, to reach each target market. Great. Break that down differently on your timeline so that you can say, okay, I'm going to reach these people this way, these people this way, these people this way. You could color code it if you wanted to. So let's start looking at how we would approach this, right? Let's say you've got that horizontal line. First thing you want to do is you want to put your launch day somewhere on there, or your launch, whatever that first day or period is of when that launch actually happens, when the thing is being executed. Plug that in so you have a fixed day to work around. Now, let's say we picked March 15th for the launch day. What you're going to notice, and I'll show you this next slide, once we've got something that's fixed, when I move on, I'm just going to show the new stuff I'm adding in orange so you can see what's different between one slide to the next. So we picked our day, our launch day of March 15th. Well, now the next step would be, are there any things that you're doing in the on-ramp? We're going to look at the on-ramp right now that are predetermined, things that you're already doing regularly that you can plug in as fixed dates to work around. So let's say we've got a monthly newsletter for this business. And so you're going to have one on January 15th and then February 15th. Maybe you do your first teaser about the thing that's coming up on January 15th, and then you mention it again in February 15th. Maybe there's a public networking event that you're going to go to somewhere in the middle of that. We're going to plug that in here. And then maybe before your launch day, you actually want to build interest. Maybe you have a physical on-site event and you want to get people excited online first. So perhaps you do a webinar to tease the event, or do a Q&A, or answer some questions that may help drive people to the event. Maybe we do that March 1st. So you start plugging those things in, and you can say, okay, those are some fixed dates that we can work around with any of the other more flexible marketing. Now, next thing I would do is say, okay, with all of that in mind, what day do I want to actually announce what's going to happen? So, perhaps we pick February 1st for something like that. It's before your networking event and that next newsletter and the webinar. But it's also after your teaser. So maybe you give something a little general here, and then you give people more details on February 1st. So you can announce through all your channels. Let's say you put it on your website, put it in a blog, put it on social media, blast it out by email, lots of options there. Okay, so now that's how you're reaching out to everybody. But what about the people who feel like they are more important, or who are more important in your community? People who are key stakeholders, people who are VIPs, people who are board members, people who should have information a little bit more in advance or in a special way. Well, maybe you plan before you even do a teaser. Maybe you reach out to those people way before that, just to fold them in, say, hey, things are coming. Maybe you give them a heads up on what might be coming ahead. That way, when they see a teaser, they're not angry about it because they weren't informed. And then maybe you do some direct outreach to customers, or maybe that's part of your group that you wanted to reach out to first. But if it wasn't, let's slot them in to make sure that they're aware of exactly what's happening as well. Now, with anything that you're launching, chances are there's materials you need to create for it. And so you want to have enough time to create that. Now, let's say you're doing like graphics or promotional materials that are all online. Great, you might not need to order things. If you do need to order something and stuff has to be proofed and mailed to you, or created by an outside party, you might want to have even more time than this. But let's say that you're doing graphics and you're creating stuff like that alone. let's say you just create some time here nice and early so that you'll have something to share in your teaser and all of the other upcoming announcements. And then, of course, and I kept this somewhat generic for the sake of just going through this quickly and giving you a broad overview. But if you're on social media on a regular basis, let's say you're doing weekly posts there, maybe you plan out, a few times a week how you're going to mention, how you're going to tease the upcoming campaign, what posts you're going to do during this time period to keep the interest up, to keep people informed. Maybe from the webinar, you get some people who sign up and they're interested in your event or your campaign. And then you want to keep them really invested to get all of those people, or as many of them as possible, to join you for the actual launch. Well, maybe you have an email sequence that you plan just for that audience. And that, let's say we've got 14 days in between here, maybe you get several emails out to them so that they are really incentivized to stick with you and do whatever the launch day activity actually is. So that just starts to show you how much you can build that out. And then you can do the same thing in the off ramp. So again, we add in those fixed opportunities. So we've got that newsletter that's monthly, where how can you plant those dates in and then figure out what you're going to put in there to follow up from your launch. Any event specific outreach that you wanted to do, after an event, you for sure want to make the first thing you do, you want to thank the people who need to be thanked. Maybe you want to crowdsource some content that you'll be able to use in your follow-up materials. You might want to check in with those partners that you talked to beforehand, see how things went for them. And then now that you've got all that, you can potentially be sharing the content that you're gathering through all of the channels you were using before, through social media, through email. One of the things that makes this work is if you're going to have an off ramp at all, you need to have things to say. It can't just be, we launched. So you can potentially gather beforehand a list of, or collect a list of the things that you want to gather during and after the event that you can use to market. Do you want to get photos? Do you want to get quotes? Do you want to get, do you want people to answer survey questions? Do you want to get stats that you can report? Can you get people to click on links or take a certain action? What are all the different types of information that you can collect from people that then you can use to drip that out after your campaign is launched, so that you can talk about the campaign, you can talk about the success of it, so you can get people excited for the next thing, so that you can get more brand awareness. Sometimes your best marketing happens after the event or after the campaign is done, because there's no pressure on people. So now if they were part of it or if they want to be part of it the next time, they can just listen with interest. But I will say, as important as the off-ramp is, if you don't plan for it, you do tend to miss it. Because anytime we do a campaign, there's so much work to do. There's so many details to consider. And a lot of time adrenaline is pumping to keep you, keep you operating, and keep things on time. And it's really pushing you. But then as soon as the campaign is launched and done, a lot of times that adrenaline fades off, and that's when we have to recuperate. Your body wants to go into recuperation mode right away. So if you didn't plan for what you're going to be doing in those follow-up days, we tend to miss it. And you don't want to, because that's the stuff that can really make a big difference for the next thing that you do, or for those relationships that you built. So, in terms of the best marketing happening in the off-ramp, what are some of the things that you can do? Well, first of all, you could potentially remind participants of the event or the campaign while it's fresh in their minds. People who were there, people who experienced the thing that you launched, you want to reinforce those good memories for them, so that maybe later on down the road, they actually want to do something about it or tell other people about it. And then part of that is, can you inspire them to share testimonials? Can you inspire them to share any content they gathered, any photos they gathered, any conversations they had? The more of that you can get, the more of that you can use later. Then you can also hopefully get them talking with each other, so you can stoke more word of mouth. And in that process, maybe that makes people who weren't with you for the launch wish they had been and paying more attention for the next time. Also, there's something about not having a hard sell right there for you that makes it easier to absorb brand recognition, right? Because any marketing you put out before a campaign happens, there's inherently a call to action tied to it. Sign up for this, register for this, buy this, come to my event. And so if people aren't prepared to do that thing, it can be like, okay, I've heard enough. I'm going to stay at a distance for this. But after your campaign is done, they may be more excited about joining in the conversation because they don't feel the pressure behind it. And so that can be a really good time to get them to be more of a part of your community. Now, one more thing I wanted to touch upon before we leave as much room as possible for questions is the idea of debriefing. Because we talked about running a timeline and planning timeline for all of this. But before I mentioned that, I talked about defining what success was. Hopefully the timeline that you created facilitates the success that you wanted to have. But whether it did or not, you've got to debrief and find out. And so part of the off-ramp is giving yourself some room to figure out, did this work? Ideally, it's not the day after, because look at all the things that you could do. You could be doing those thank you messages. You can be doing surveys. You can be gathering information from people. But eventually you do want to be able to talk with your team or just talk with your stakeholders or just sit and look at the stats. Whoever needs to be involved in a debrief, you want to grab them, bring them together, and build it into your schedule so you actually have a chance to evaluate what happened. You want to ask questions like, did you accomplish your objectives? Are there ways to, in a tangible way, determine, did we meet the objectives? The only way you can do that is by having defined them up front. So if you define them and you needed to collect information, hopefully you've now got that where you can sit with it and evaluate it. That could be potentially data that you've collected. Could also be feedback that you've gathered from any key stakeholders or different branches of stakeholders. If you have a team with you, talking to your team is also really important. It's not just about going externally and getting information from people outside of your group or your company. It's also about looking internally and saying what worked well for the campaign that we did, what could be better, what could work better next time. There's always going to be things that need to be tweaked from one campaign to the next, but can you figure out like, what are the things we want to hang on to and what are the things that really need to be adjusted here? I will say, if you don't build in this time, what ends up happening is people just bounce from one campaign to the next, not really knowing if they worked, not really knowing what working looks like. And it means that everything that you're doing ends up being a lot more surface. I believe that any campaign you do is a potential to really strengthen a lot of relationships, but staying surface level doesn't allow that to happen. So having that time for reflection will improve the process later. So, having said all of this, I encourage you, if you have any campaign of your own that you're planning to run, or if you're in the middle of something right now, build in that time to pause, to prep, to analyze, build it in before, build it in after. And if you strategize for that, you will optimize the campaigns that you're doing. Again, this sounds like a lot of work to do, but I'm telling you, the more you can squeeze every last drop out of every campaign, the more efficient each campaign will actually be, maybe the less you need to do. So it's something to consider as you look at your calendar for, the year, for 2025, for whatever's ahead for you. I want to make sure we save tons of time for questions here, or as much as we possibly can anyway. And I encourage you to get in any questions, even if they're specific to something that you're working on, because I think it helps people to sort of deal with some real life examples as they think things through. But I'm just going to remind you what we've covered here so far in case it helps you think about questions. We talked about defining what a campaign even is. We talked about setting objectives and what some of those objectives could be. We looked at having a structure for establishing a timeline and how you can start slotting things in for your own business, for your own campaigns. And then we talked a little bit about this idea of debriefing. And as you get any questions in that you may want to ask, just a couple things that are coming up. July 23rd, we're going to talk about pinpointing your perfect brand and target market. It's not a bad one to follow up with this one because, again, brand awareness is such a big thing around any campaign that you're doing. Target markets have a lot to do with how we market. Obviously, that's come up a lot in this session. And if you feel like maybe this revealed that you need to work a little bit more on those things, that'll be a good one to go to. August 20th, we're going to talk about how to win at social media. We're going to talk about that from an organic standpoint, not from an advertising standpoint, but from an organic marketing standpoint. And having said that, a couple of quick resources I want to throw in there. That top link there, hopefully we can get that into the chat. But that top link is the link to the landing page on my website that has the whole slide deck, a number of additional resources and rating materials. The only thing it's going to be missing is the recording for this presentation, which Julie is working on. And then, of course, if any of this inspired you to have a conversation with the ASBTDC about a campaign that you have coming up, I wanted to make sure that second link is there so that you can access the ASBTDC and hopefully get some time on their calendar as well. And I wanted to throw it over to Julie to make sure that Julie has a chance to talk about that as well. So I'll do that now as we see if any questions are coming in.
Okay, if you are not a client of the Arkansas Small Business and Technology Development Center, if you go to our website at sbtdc.uark.edu, I'm going to put that in the chat, and sign up. One of our consultants will reach out to you, set up a time to discuss what your needs are. I've also entered into the chat the page where you can register for Melissa's upcoming webinars, as well as our other trainings that we have scheduled for this summer. So I'm going to go ahead and put the overall website into the chat so that you have that information.
Awesome. So we have a question from Renee here that I'll start with. If you've already launched a website but didn't do any kind of campaign prior to launch, what do you recommend to make up for it? This is why I wanted to save as much time as possible for questions here, because this is the really juicy stuff. And frankly, like who did all this before they launched their website, So I imagine there's more than one person here that this could relate to. What I do want to be careful with is let's not use a word like rebrand unless we need to, or relaunch unless we need to. But there's never, a time like the present to come up with a reason to get people back to your website. So, this is a good time to start looking at all of the channels that you do have for marketing, and sort of doing a, hey, in case you missed it, sort of a spirit around a campaign. Find a reason to drive people there in general, or run a contest or something that's on your website to make people get to a specific page of your website or to look around your website. You could do a contest around trivia related to your website, and whoever responds, there's a potential prize in it. And now you're reintroducing it, but the same thing. So there's a lot of options there for it. But one of the things that happens so very, like, I cannot tell you how many times I hear people tell me, oh, I'm going to launch my website and I don't want to tell anybody about it. Or you're not thinking about telling anybody about it because you're just working so hard to get everything else done. But then what tends to happen, and this may have been your experience, Renee, is that you then launch a website and it's like, it feels no different than the day before when you weren't launched yet. And that can be a real letdown when you're running a business where it's like, I'm so excited. Oh, nobody is excited with me. So we want to prevent that as much as possible by bringing people along for the ride. You don't have to pretend like it wasn't launched before and try to relaunch it. You could just, do like a getting to know my website sort of a campaign to make sure that people are consistently getting back to it over a defined period of time, maybe for a defined reason. So that would be something that I would look at there. And if there are any other questions that anybody wants to pose, especially if there's something coming up for you that you feel like, how do I get the most out of this? I often look at things like, for example, like if you have an event coming up, who are all the different types of people that you can fold in? Are there other businesses in your area that aren't doing the exact same thing as you, but are reaching the same audience as you, that you can find a way for them to be involved, or you can find a way to cross market with them for things that they're working on? Do you have anything that needs judges? Do you have anything, where you can get people who are, sort of folded in as sort of a committee for gathering crowdsourced content or other content? What are all the different creative ways that you can not just reach your existing audience, but build it? If you have something where you're only trying to reach your existing audience, that's fine too. But that could be like an employee training event. But there may even be opportunities within something like that that can be leveraged. And it's always worth looking at that stuff just to see. But I'm curious, for those who are listening in here live with me, do you have anything that is coming up? And if so, what category is it? And I'm actually going to go back to my definition of different types of campaigns that you could run. Do you have anything on this list coming up? I'd be very curious if the people who are on with us live have something under one of those headings that is on the horizon for you and may have been how you were looking at all of this information here. So that's sort of for my own purposes. But Stephanie's saying anniversary of the company, 3 years. Amazing. First of all, amazing. Congratulations. That's a big milestone. Not a lot of businesses reach it. So it's very exciting stuff. And goodness, you can fold everybody in on that because everybody was part of you getting to 3 years. So that's so good. Xavier's, I have a podcast launch coming up. Awesome. So many people you can fold in there depending on what the type of, if it's something where you're interviewing guests or if it's something where you're presenting information, there could be a lot of ways to celebrate that in a larger community. Mary Beth, I'm planning on launching some print material magazine for my wedding photography business. Oh, that's wonderful. And that is an awesome reason also to get back in touch with like previous or lapsed clients. We sometimes forget about those folks, but that's a really fun opportunity to sort of fold them back in. I love it. And Javery is launching my credit repair services. So it sounds like you already have some services that are going, and this is a new component that you're adding. So that's a really fun element. And it'll be interesting to see with something like that. One of the things that you might have in mind is trying to figure out, of your existing client base who are using other services, which of them are going to sort of also be interested in this. So can you figure out what demographic you're sort of pulling from? Like if you have more than one target market for more than one service, which ones are most likely to make their way over to your credit repair services as well? And that could be some stats that you start gathering in the process of launching this. So I love it. Everybody's got, so far of the examples we've gotten, everybody has something completely different that they're thinking of as a campaign. And hopefully all of you feel like a model like this can work for you as long as you plug in your own platforms and ways that you're, reaching your existing audience. But I love this. And, if any of you do have any additional questions that are specific to what you're launching, let me know. But yeah, I mean, this is also hopefully a chance for you to connect back with ASB TDC itself and book some time.
We're here, ready to help you. So, okay, any other questions, you guys, that you would like to ask before we close? Okay, so if not, I would just like to thank you, Melissa, again for joining us. Honestly, I do feel like you're a member of our team because we work so closely together, and it's just always great to visit with you and get your expertise on marketing and also hear about all the interesting things that you're involved in. So thanks again, and hope everyone has a great summer. Don't forget that you can register for Melissa's next webinar at our website, our events website, and I put that in the chat. So you can also, again, look at sbtdc.uark.edu and take a look at our resources as well as those event registrations. And finally, the recording will be up later this afternoon, so you can review all of this and continue to make plans for your next launch. So thanks, Melissa.
Thank you all.